Hi, welcome to the Writer's Block. I'm Garfield Ellis, and this is a spot where we talk to writers of every ilk from everywhere. And today we have with us Mr. W.B. Garvey, novelist, classical musician, and relative of one of our great national heroes. W.B. Can I call it W.B.?
Please do.
All right.
That's good.
Welcome to the block.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
How are you today? You are doing well?
I'm fine. I'm enjoying being back in Jamaica, where the weather is beautiful all the time.
You are related to Marcus Garvey. What is that relationship?
Well, my grandfather and he are cousins.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, growing up, I went to school out here, and growing up, I couldn't go anywhere when I mentioned my name. Of course, the first thing they want to know, oh, you're related to Marcus. So all my life, you know, that has followed me around. And so I always knew I had to learn about him. And the more I learned about him, the more inspired I got. And that's part of the reason I wrote this book. When
you say you are a relative of Garvey and you write, do people expect you to be writing about Garvey?
Not necessarily. When I say this inspired me to write, what I mean is that I took from him the fact that he said something that stuck with me. He said, if you have something in your bosom, if you have a talent, bring it to me and share it. And I've always wanted to write. I've always been fascinated with history, our history, particularly as people of the diaspora. So, you know, when I discovered that my grandfather worked on the Panama Canal, which I didn't know him, and I didn't know that.
Mm-hmm.
When I found that out, I remembered something that Amy Jakes Garvey, Marcus Garvey's widow, told me when I first met her. She said, never forget, it was American money that built the Panama Canal, French brains that thought it up, but it was West Indian sweat and blood. And it was the fact that when her husband went to Panama first to work, and he saw the conditions under which our Jamaican workers were being treated, that he decided, all right, we have to organize and do something to defend ourselves against this.
How did you come to the story, to the information about the book?
The book sort of came out of my interest in my own grandfather. How did he fit into this? Because I found out later he was a railroad engineer. And all I knew about the Jamaicans that they were diggers, basically. But that's not true. They did a lot of different things. They were masons and plumbers and carpenters and telegraph operators and railroad engineers. So when I found this out, I said, this story has not been delved into. But then when I got into the story itself and the research, trying to find out, okay, what did he do? What was the circumstances that drew him there? I realized that the story went even further back. And it started, actually, the canal relationship with Jamaica started under the French in the 1880s. This would be before my grandfather's time even. So when I started into that story, that took me even deeper into the history, and then I saw it as an epic story, because here we have a situation in which thousands, tens of thousands of Jamaicans are going to work on this canal. And many of them are not coming back. In fact, 20,000 died in this effort, and it was a failed effort. And yet they're forgotten completely, both here and in Panama. So that inspired me.
A failed effort. I'll get back to that, because you're talking about the French era. That was a failed effort. Because the Panama Canal was built in two stages.
Correct.
There was the American stage and the first was
the French stage.
And that failed.
That failed completely. And one of the reasons it failed was because they didn't understand what caused yellow fever, what spread it.
Okay. And then there's a second phase. So your novel covers both phases.
My novel covers the French period alone.
Okay, just the French period.
Yes, I have a second book coming which will cover the American period. But this book, Panama Fever, Digging Down Gold Mountain, only covers the French period, which runs from the book itself runs from 1882 to roughly around 1887, 88. And the whole thing crumbled in 1888, 89.
But you are a classical musician. What are you doing writing books?
Well, you know, it's interesting because there's a book called Literary Garveyism by Tony Martin, who's one of the great Garvey scholars. And in it he has something that he says that's really true. He says the arts are related. Music, writing, poetry, drama, they're all related. And it's true. You found a lot of, like Augusta Savage, who was a wonderful sculptor. She was a Garveyite, but she was also a poet. And if you look at the librettos that composers write around, sometimes they write their own librettos. So it's not that alien for a musician to write. But in my case, yes, it was a bit ambitious. But I had done writing before. I'd done some writing in college, and I'd always liked to write. So I said, this is a subject that requires someone to delve into deeply, and so I took it on.
Quickly, before we go back into the book, I'm interested in your life as a classical musician. I've never met a classical musician before. So
don't say it like that. We're not like that at all.
You're not like classical.
No.
It's like classical.
Classical.
Okay,
that's
all
cool.
Well, listen about that. I became a musician. And
Yeah,
some of the things that you did.
I was inspired, believe it or not, at the age of like, well, I think it was like 22 months, something like that. Because my parents had taken me to hear Young Roberts, who was a young African-American child prodigy. And he played both the violin and the piano. And I heard him and I just fell in love with it right away. So it was like before I even knew myself, I was in love with music.
Okay.
And my uncle played the violin. My cousin is a pianist, Kessner Robertson. And so it was not a strange thing at all in our family to have music around. And I remember when I was little, they couldn't get me to sleep unless they played the Beethoven Violin Concerto. When I was like 3,
Yes.
I had my own little record player, and I wouldn't go to sleep unless they played that concerto for me. So, it's always been something in me. I don't know where it came from, but it's something that's been in me. And of course, it was inspiring when I grew up and found out that Marcus loved opera. So it was like, okay.
So you did a lot of this training here in Jamaica?
I studied in Jamaica, yes. Noel Foster Davis was my teacher, and I was studying with her for 6 years.
That was what? During the what? The
60s, during the 60s.
The 60s.
Yes.
It was common in those days for young people to get into classical music.
It was it was considered you should learn an instrument. Everybody, that could would learn an instrument. Usually the piano, but sometimes the organ or a stringed instrument, the violin or the cello or the flute. Everybody wanted to have a little bit of music around. And at that time, her studio was quite large. And after I went to England at the age of 16, and I came back and I taught for a year before I went to university. So, music has always been part of my life.
And you have had some successes. You have played on musical scores.
I've actually been involved in many different aspects of music, which I find very gratifying. I have not only done classical work, I've worked with jazz musicians like Wynton Marsalis, popular musicians like Aretha Franklin, and I've had the chance to play on film scores for Spike Lee and Martin Scorsese. So I've done the whole gamut, and it's really been a very rich experience.
Is it something that you find a lot of Black West Indians succeeding in, this classical music?
Surprisingly, we have many successes. Noreen Barrett, for instance, is a wonderful classical pianist. Julian Barber, wonderful classical violist. They're both Jamaicans, They're of international stature. Now, it's not an easy thing for West Indians to get the recognition they sometimes deserve, but certainly we have Paul Shaw, for instance, who's a wonderful pianist. We have a lot of talented Jamaicans in the classical field.
So now you have flexed your creative muscle, and you have exceeded and succeeded in classical music, and now the same muscle is being flexed in another direction. And let's just talk a little bit about this novel now, and what do you want to do with it? What did you want to do with this book?
What I wanted most of all was to fill a gap. Growing up, I never knew anything about this French period with the canal. I didn't know much about who built the canal itself. You sort of hear people know Americans built the Panama Canal. Well, that's only really a small part of the story. So I wanted to fill in some of the gap, but I also wanted something much more. I wanted people to get this sense of the epic struggle that it was to make this. I wanted these characters to represent a struggle that was larger than life, because the guys that went there to build that canal really believed they were doing something of international import.
And the Jamaican and Caribbean labor force that went there formed the backbone of that construction.
Exactly. 90% of the workers came from the Caribbean.
90%?
90%. If in the French period, it was primarily Jamaicans that went. Under the Americans, it would be an entire, Caribbean workforce that went, Barbadians primarily. But during the French period, most of the workers, not all, but most of the workers came from Jamaica. They were recruited to come from Jamaica. And one of the reasons they chose Jamaica was because during the 1850s, You know, you heard of the gold rush.
Yes.
Right. Well, everybody wanted to get to California. But if you wanted to sail there, you had to sail from New York. You had to go all the way around Cape Horn, all the way around.
Mm-hmm.
So it would take, you know, much too long to get there. By the time they were afraid by the time they get there, the gold would be gone. So they would go to Panama, get off the ship, take a mule train through the jungle, and then catch another ship on the other side in Panama City. Well, that 50-mile trek was not easy. And truly, some people didn't make it because of yellow fever or for whatever reason. It was an arduous trip.
And then somebody said, let's
build a railroad. This is the 1850s
okay.
now. Let's build a railroad.
Mm-hmm.
But you had the same problem with the yellow fever and so forth. First, they brought down Irish to work on it. They died like flies. They brought down Chinese to work on it. They died like flies. So finally said, all right, we're going to bring some Jamaicans to work on it. And the Jamaicans finished the job. And so when the French decided to come, they decided, oh, well, we know the Jamaicans can do the job because they built the railroads. We're going to have them work on our canal.
All right. Hold that thought.
Okay.
Hold that thought. We're getting into the meat of it.
Okay.
And we're going to take a little break and come back. All right?
All right, excellent.
Well, we're here with Mr. Garvey, W.B. Garvey, and we're talking about this great book, Digging Down Gold Mountain. And we'll be right back.